Season 2 of The Mandalorian kicks off with the Mandalorian and the child heading to a kind of an MMA or a boxing match. And he's looking for a guy by the name of Gora Koresh who's a gambler. And when he finds Gora Koresh at the fight, he tells him that he's been instructed to get the child back to his own kind. And to do that, he needs to find more Mandalorians. And from what the Mandalorian has heard, Gora Koresh knows where to find some. So he's come looking to get Gora Koresh's help, willing to pay for it. But instead, Gora Koresh offers him a deal, saying that if Gora's guy wins the fight, the Mandalorian will give him his Beskar armor. But if the Mandalorian's guy wins, then he'll happily give up the information. The Mandalorian says, no, I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to leave this up to chance. And it turns out Gora Koresh wasn't really in the mood to do that either, shooting the one fighter and having his goons surround the Mandalorian with guns pointed at his head. And Mando tells him, we don't have to do this. Just tell me where the Mandalorians are, and I won't have to kill you guys. And Gora Koresh kind of cracks up along with his men, but Baby Yoda knows better and ends up hiding in his pod. And that's when the Mandalorian fires off a bunch of whistling birds that end up taking out a lot of Gora's men. And the ones that did survive, the Mandalorian makes quick work out of them. And when Gora saw what was happening, he fled the scene. But the Mandalorian catches up to him, tying him up on a light post, and threatening to kill him if he doesn't give up the information of where the Mandalorians are. And Gora tells him that there's one on Tatooine, but the Mandalorian says, I was at Tatooine, and I didn't see a Mandalorian or hear about one. But Gora swears that his information is good, telling the Mandalorian that this particular Mandalorian is in a place on Tatooine called Mas Pelgo. So with that information, the Mandalorian leaves Gora Koresh hanging from the light post as him and the child take off for Tatooine. And upon arrival on Tatooine, they park their ship at Peli's, the mechanic/junker. And she's more than happy to see the Mandalorian, but she's even more excited to see Baby Yoda. He tells Peli that he needs to get Baby Yoda back to his kind, and he needs Mandalorians to help him do that. And he's shown up on Tatooine looking for one. But Peli tells him, you're the first Mandalorian I've seen in I don't know how long. So he asks her about Mas Pelgo, because Mas Pelgo isn't on any of the maps. And she informs him that it's not on any of the maps because it was wiped out by bandits. Once the Empire fell, it was a free-for-all. She shows him on a map where Mas Pelgo used to be, and it really is in the middle of nowhere. So he borrows the speeder from her, grabs Baby Yoda, and heads off, locating Mas Pelgo and walking into the local tavern, and it appears that he is the first visitor there in a while. He asks the bartender if there are any Mandalorians in the town, and the bartender doesn't really know what he's talking about, so he says, you know, people that look like me. And he says, oh yeah, the Marshal. And as soon as he says that, sure enough, the Marshal does arrive, dressed up like a Mandalorian in Mandalorian armor. And as soon as he sees him, the Mandalorian tells him, I've been searching for you for a long time. And the Marshal instructs the bartender to pour them both a drink. And the bartender does that, and the Marshal goes to sit down, but when he does so, he takes his helmet off, which is a dead giveaway that he's not an actual Mandalorian. The Marshal tells him, you know, I've never met an actual Mandalorian. I mean, I've heard the stories, I know you're good at killing, and I'm sure you're not too happy with me to see me wearing this armor. So I figured that only one of us was walking out of here, but then I saw the little guy, and I thought, you know, maybe I pegged you wrong. And at that moment, he introduces himself as Cobb Vanth, the Marshal of Mas Pelgo. He tells him that he got the armor from some Jawas, and the Mandalorian demands that he turn it over. And they get into a little bit of a tiff, and it seems like they're about to go at each other when all of a sudden the ground starts rumbling. And when they go outside to check it out, this big Kryot dragon shows up in the town. And Vanth says, I'll tell you what, if you help me kill that thing, I'll give you the armor, because that thing has been terrorizing this town for far too long. And that sounds like a pretty good deal to the Mandalorians. So the two head off to try to find out where it's located. And during the trip, Vanth tells them the story of Mas Pelgo. And the backstory is the downfall of Mas Pelgo really started after the destruction of the second Death Star. The Empire was pulling out and people were celebrating. But that very same night, a group called the Mining Collective moved in and enslaved the entire town overnight. Vanth was able to escape and even was able to steal an item from the Mining Collective, which proved to be very valuable. It ended up being a bunch of crystals, which were worth a lot of money. And when Vanth was picked up by scavengers after traveling for days in the desert, he ended up trading the crystals for a bunch of water to hydrate up and the Mandalorian armor. And with that armor, he headed back into town, got the Mining Collective to flee, and ended up taking them all out with a missile. Ever since then, he's been the Marshal of Mas Pelgo. They then get to a cavern where they're approached by a bunch of, I'm sure there's a technical term for it and someone will put it in the comments, but dogs. And Vanth is pretty scared off by these. He wants to shoot them up, but the Mandalorian hops off and starts petting them. And that's when Tusken Raiders appear from behind the rocks. And the Mandalorian speaks to them in their language, and it turns out that the Tusken Raiders want exactly what the townspeople want, for the dragon to be slayed. So that night, they all sit down and have a conversation about it, but Vanth and the Tusken Raiders end up getting into it. The Tusken Raiders are pissed off because Vanth killed their people. And Vanth is saying, well, I killed your people because I was protecting the town. The Mandalorian gets in between both of them and says, if we keep fighting amongst ourselves, this is not going to end well. So they refocus on how to kill this thing. And the next morning, the raiders bring them to the entrance of the cave where it sleeps, and they show them the normal ritual that they have to feed it, to keep it at bay. This way, the dragon sleeps longer and their settlement isn't bothered. And after this, the group ends up making a little bit of a diagram to game plan. And the diagram lays out how big this thing is, and they realize they're going to need the townspeople from Mos Pelgo to help out with this. And it's a tough sell. The townspeople aren't too thrilled to hear that they're going to have to work with the Tusken Raiders. But Vanth says it's only a matter of time before this thing comes for us. We're actually lucky it hasn't done so already. So let's put our bickering aside and work with these people. The Mandalorian also mentions that they've come to an agreement with the Tusken Raiders, that if everybody works together to destroy this thing, there will be peace. The Tusken Raiders will not attack them unless they're attacked first. So everybody grabs a bunch of explosives, heads to the cave, and starts going to work on planning to kill this thing. They're able to lure the dragon out of the cave, and after some prodding, they're able to get it in place to set off the explosion, but the explosion doesn't kill it. They're actually not quite sure where the dragon went, all looking around. And that's when the dragon pops up out of the mountaintop, spraying everybody with this acidic vomit. The Mandalorian and Vanth know that they have to get this thing back to the ground, so using the Mandalorian armor, they fly up and distract it to head back down. And that plan works. And when it gets back to the ground, the Mandalorian stands next to the offering, holding the detonation trigger, and intentionally gets swallowed by the dragon. But this allows the Mandalorian to leave a bunch of the explosives inside of the dragon and set it off. And that works. The Mandalorian flies out of the dragon's mouth just in enough time, setting it off, and the dragon explodes. And everybody, townspeople, Tusken Raiders alike, all start celebrating. And as the townspeople and the Tusken Raiders end up picking apart the dead carcass of the dragon, Vanth is true to his word, handing over the armor and telling him, I hope our paths cross again. But as the Mandalorian is speeding back to his ship, a very scarred up Boba Fett watches in the distance. In episode 2, the Mandalorian is heading back to his ship on the speeder when he's attacked by raiders. The incident does get a little hairy for a second, with one of them putting a knife to the child's throat, but the Mandalorian trades his jetpack for the child's life. He then activates the jetpack, killing the raider and getting his jetpack back. The problem is, his speeder was destroyed in the process, and it forces the Mandalorian and the child to walk back to town with all of their stuff. So the Mandalorian walks into a bar where he finds Peli in a card game with a mandible. And he explains to Peli everything that just happened, why he doesn't have a speeder, and how while he does have this Mandalorian armor, it wasn't actually a Mandalorian. And he's frustrated because that was the last lead he had to finding an actual Mandalorian. And the mandible that Peli is playing cards against says that he's willing to put the Mandalorian in contact with somebody who knows where other Mandalorians are, as long as he covers the take for his card game. And the Mandalorian reluctantly gives up the money, and the mandible tells him that the contact is going to meet the Mandalorian at the hangar. So him and Peli head off to the hangar, and Peli has gotten more details about what he's looking for. She tells him that a Mandalorian is close. He's actually in the sector. She's not quite sure if they're the ones that left Nevarro. All she knows is that the contact is going to lead him to them. The only catch is that the contact wants passage to the planet. And the Mandalorian isn't too thrilled about that, saying, I'm not a taxi service, but he gets even more pissed off when Peli lets him know that he can't use lightspeed, which to him is a non-starter because even though he's only one sector over, moving fast is the only thing that keeps him safe. But Peli explains this is mitigating circumstances, and that's when the contact shows up. And the contact is a frog carrying her eggs, which the child is transfixed on. There is a language barrier between the frog and the Mandalorian, so Peli has to translate. And the frog explains that he can't go fast because if he does, it's going to end up destroying her eggs. And these eggs are the last of her line. So if these eggs are destroyed, her line ends. So she wants the Mandalorian to take her to her husband, who has settled on a moon one sector over. And she reassures him that there are Mandalorians on this planet. Her husband has seen them. And with no other real option, the Mandalorian agrees to take her aboard. So they slowly head off to the sector, and the Mandalorian charts a course, and then heads downstairs to get some sleep, where he catches the child eating the eggs. He scolds the child, telling him this isn't food, and then the two head off for a nap. But he's awakened when alarms are going off. And alarms are going off because there are two X-Wings on either side of his ship. And they want to know why he doesn't have this certain type of hardware that the Mandalorian honestly didn't even know that he needed. But there are new rules in this sector, and he does need it. So the Mandalorian tells them, okay, thanks, I'll get that fixed ASAP. They then request that he send them a ping. the X-Wings are out there sweeping for Imperial holdouts. And the Mandalorian really doesn't want to send them a ping. He starts making excuses, saying that the hardware isn't working, but they tell them that if the hardware isn't working, we're going to have you follow us to an outpost to make sure you're okay. So he sends a ping, and they run it. And when they do that, they set up the X-Wing for battle and then ask him if his ship was in proximity to the New Republic correctional transport, that same job that he did for Ranzer's group of mercenaries. And when they ask that question, the Mandalorian knows that his time is running up, so he flees, going to the closest planet and trying to lose them, and he is able to lose them. But when he does that, he kind of crashes his ship in the process. It's not totaled until the ice that he's on ends up breaking, the ship crashing through and landing, and at that point, the ship is kind of destroyed. And the frog is pretty distressed, but because of the language barrier, the Mandalorian can't understand her. So he tells her, look, I don't really know what you're saying right now, but whatever it is, it can wait till morning. You might as well get some rest. But she can't wait till the next day. So she actually hijacks the broken droid Zero from the mercenary job and uses it to translate for her, waking up the Mandalorian, telling him through the droid that it's of the utmost importance that they get to this moon with her husband immediately. She once again explains the severity of the situation and demands that he honor their deal. But the Mandalorian says, lady, the deal is off. She then guilt trips him, saying, I thought honoring one's word was a part of the Mandalorian code, but I guess that's just something they tell kids. And that guilt trip works. The Mandalorian goes outside and starts passing the hall, but the child comes and finds him and lets him know that the frog has taken off. So, using the heat signature, the Mandalorian follows the footprints and finds the frog in a hot spring, keeping her eggs warm. He kind of scolds her a bit, saying that she never should have left the ship because nightfall is coming and she really needs to pack up the eggs and head back to the ship. He understands why she did it. She wants to keep her eggs warm, but it's still not the safest thing to do. The child, meanwhile, having been told not to eat the eggs, walks around the cavern and finds another egg, this one hidden in the ground, and the child starts eating it. But when he does, all of the other eggs that are around start hatching, and spiders start coming out of them. And then the two spiders probably made those eggs, end up coming out of a cave, and they are not happy that somebody was eating their eggs. And at this point, the Mandalorian, the frog, and the child know they need to get the hell out of there ASAP. So they grab the frog's eggs and they start heading back to the ship, trying to fight off all these spiders, but it's tough to do because these spiders are in the hundreds. The Mandalorian is able to kill one of the main spiders by throwing detonation charges at him, and luckily that takes out one of them. But the spider hatchlings continue their pursuit of the Mandalorian. And the Mandalorian and the frog and the child barely get into the cockpit alive. They then try to take off, praying that the Mandalorian's makeshift repairs hold up, but when they do so, the second huge spider ends up landing on top of the ship, crashing it down once again, and shoving two of its legs in the cockpit. But right as the huge spider is about to take a bite out of the cockpit, something from the outside starts fighting it off. And the Mandalorian slowly makes his way out of the ship to see who the hell is fighting off this spider, to find the two X-Wings that were chasing them. And luckily for the Mandalorian, the X-Wings take care of the spider, killing it. They then explain to the Mandalorian, though, that there's a warrant out for his arrest for what he did with the mercenary group breaking out Quinn. And because of this, they really should arrest him. But their onboard security records show that he apprehended 3 culprits from the wanted registry, and he risked his own life to protect Lieutenant Davin from the New Republic Correctional Facility. And because of all this, they take off. They don't arrest him, although they also don't help him repair the ship. So that's on the Mandalorian. And he makes some makeshift repairs, and him, the child, and the frog limp their way off to the moon where the frog's husband is located. In episode 3, after a long journey, they finally arrived at the planet, but their ship is so destroyed that they're coming in slow and all over the place. It's forcing the ship to really heat up, and it's making landing the ship very, very difficult. The Mandalorian does get some help from the frog, and it seems like they're about to land this thing safely, when all of a sudden one of the engines goes out, forcing the ship into the water. They get fished out by the local fishermen, and it forces the Mandalorian to have to pay to get the ship fixed. And the Mon Calamari that's supposed to fix the ship isn't exactly reassuring, just saying, yeah, I'll make it fly. The frog, meanwhile, has excitedly located her husband, and the husband profusely thanks the Mandalorian for delivering his wife safely to the planet. And maybe more importantly, delivering the eggs safely. The husband tells him to head to the inn, and that's where he can find some people of his own kind. But unbeknownst to the Mandalorian, he's actually being watched by someone who disappears as quickly as they showed up. Although, once again, the Mandalorian doesn't know this, so he just heads off to the tavern, where he sits down to find out where his own kind are. But the tavern owner is a little annoyed because his rule is, if you sit down, you have to eat something, and the Mandalorian doesn't want to eat anything. He just wants to get food for the child. He does tell the owner, however, I'm willing to pay for information. Do you know of anybody that are my kind? And he tells him, yeah, actually, others with Beskar have been through here. And he tells him that he knows somebody who might help. He goes over to another a table and gets that guy. And it's a fisherman who tells him, yeah, I know where Mandalorians are. It's a few-hour trip, but it's going to cost you. And the Mandalorian's willing to pay, so the Mandalorian hops on the guy's ship, and the fishing vessel takes off. The fisherman asks the Mandalorian, have you ever seen a mambacore eat? And tells him that it's quite a sight, and maybe the child would want to watch. And as the fishermen are dropping down fish into the tank, the fisherman tells the Mandalorian, this is going to be quite a sight. We haven't fed her all day. But then at the last minute, the fisherman kicks the child's pod into the water, and the Mandalorian frantically jumps in to save the child, but it's too late. Whatever was in that fish tank swallows the child's pod. And the fisherman trapped the Mandalorian in there because the whole time, this was an ambush set up to steal the Mandalorian's Beskar. But luckily for the Mandalorian, the person that was watching him from a distance was actually a Mandalorian. And Mando is saved by 3 other of his kind. They fight off the fisherman, save the Mandalorian, and even get the child back. As he's holding the child, he tells him, thank God, I've been looking for you guys for a while now. I've been entrusted with taking this child back to, but he stops his train of thought because the Mandalorians that are standing in front of him have taken off their helmets, and that's a big no-no. He demands to know, where did you get that armor? But their leader, a woman by the name of Bo-Katan Kryze, tells him that the armor's been in her family for 3 generations. And he scolds them, saying, you guys aren't Mandalorian, you're not supposed to take your helmet off. And one of the Mandalorians that's standing next to Bo-Katan, a guy named Ferric, says, oh, he's one of them. And the Mandalorian says, one of what? She explains that she was born in Mandalore and fought in the Purge, and she's the last of her line. And the Mandalorian is something that they refer to as a child of the Watch. They're like a cult of religious zealots that broke away from the society in order to reestablish the ancient way. But the Mandalorian doesn't take too kindly to hearing that he's a part of a cult, and he tells her there's only one way, and he flies off. He lands on the shore and watches the Mandalorians, all 3 of them, destroy the ship and fly off. As the Mandalorian is walking around the harbor, he gets approached by the fisherman's brother and a bunch of other fishermen. And they want vengeance for the fact that they think that the Mandalorian killed the same guy who was actually trying to ambush him. They tell the Mandalorian, you killed our brother, now we're going to kill your pet, meaning the child. But then, right before they actually square off, the 3 Mandalorians from before fly out from the sky, and Bo-Katan says, he didn't kill your brother, I did. And they quickly wipe all of these fishermen out. They then ask the Mandalorian, hey, can we at least buy you a drink and explain ourselves? So the group heads into the local tavern. Bo-Katan explains that they're currently located in a black market port. At the moment, they're buying and selling all of the things from their own planet of Mandalore. And the reason Bo-Katan and her group are there is because they're re-seizing all of the weapons that they're selling, with the plan that they're going to use those weapons to retake Mandalore. And once they do that, they can seat any Mandalore on the throne. Although it seems like Bo-Katan has a pretty good idea of who she wants on the throne. Okay, so that's their plan, and the Mandalorian explains his plan with the child getting him back to his own people. And in order to do that, he needs to find the Jedi. So he tells them, I was hoping you guys could help me because it's part of our creed. And Bo-Katan says, okay, I can lead you to a Jedi, but first, we need your help. They head outside and are looking at an Imperial freighter, and Bo-Katan explains that inside that freighter is loaded with weapons, and they want those weapons. So the group comes up with a plan on how to get aboard the ship. So before going on this mission, the Mandalorian heads to the Frog's house, drops the child off to be watched, and then he goes and helps Bo-Katan's group. And once the freighter takes off, the Mandalorians, using their jetpacks, hop on top and start taking out stormtroopers. It's pretty easy for them to do, but the commotion does alert the cockpit that they're being attacked by, quote, pirates. And because of this, they go into a lockdown. Although that doesn't prove much good. The Mandalorians are quickly moving through the ship like a hot knife through butter. They get to the part of the ship where all the guns are held, and once the door opens, the Imperial captain tells them to close the doors immediately. He doesn't want any of that. And he thinks he's in the clear. He's really proud of himself. Unfortunately, he's unaware that the Mandalorians can open up the cargo bay, and they do that with the Imperial captain and all of these stormtroopers flying out of it. Bo-Katan grabs a radio and radios to the captain in the cockpit that they have the weapons and imagine what they're going to do with them. But he lets her know, if you think you're escaping with those weapons, you're sadly mistaken. If you try to escape with them, we're going to find you and kill you. But Bo-Katan says, oh, we're not stealing them, we're stealing your ship. And that wasn't a part of the agreement that the Mandalorian made with Bo-Katan. She explains to the Mandalorian that there's something that she needs in order to rule Mandalore, something that was once hers but was taken from her. And the Imperial guards know where it is. So she needs to find that information out, but also she needs the ship for the battles ahead. And she tells him, if you want my help finding the Jedi, you will help me take this ship. He tells her, you're changing the terms of our deal. And she tells him, this is the way. Now, while they were squabbling about the arrangement that they made, the captain of the ship got in touch with Moff Gideon, telling him that they've been attacked by pirates. The captain asked for backup immediately, but Moff Gideon says, it's too late for that. It's pointless if we give you backup. He says to the captain, you know what to do. And the captain nods and then shoots the 2 pilots and points the ship downward because The captain has been instructed to crash the ship, and Bo-Katan and her group realize this. So they quickly try to get to the front of the cockpit, and after fighting off some more stormtroopers, they're able to do this at the very last second. The Mandalorian, along with one of the Mandalorians from Bo-Katan's group, pull the ship back up. But while that was going on, Bo-Katan was busy putting a knife to the captain's throat, and you find out what that item was that was taken from her. She demands to know where the darksaber is. The same saber that Moff Gideon used to cut out of his ship in the last episode of Season 1. She asks the captain if Moff Gideon has it, and the captain says if you're asking, you already know. And the captain, knowing that if Bo-Katan doesn't kill him, Moff Gideon will, ends up committing suicide. Looks like he kind of electrocuted himself. Bo-Katan is pretty pissed off, but the job is done, and she offers the Mandalorian one more chance to join them, but he says no, I have to get the child back to his people. So she tells him that he can find the Jedi on a forest planet named Corvus. And on that planet, there's a Jedi named Ahsoka Tano. She then thanks the Mandalorian for his bravery, telling him it won't be forgotten, and the two go their separate ways. The Mandalorian then picks up the child from the frog's house, thanks them for their hospitality, and goes to pick up his repaired ship. And I use the term repaired loosely. I mean, this guy just took the Mandalorian's money. It's a real shame. But, mechanics. The Mandalorian, along with the child, then hop in the barely repaired ship and head off to the forest planet to find themselves some Jedi. In Episode 4, the repairs that were made simply aren't good enough. The ship is going to need to stop off and get a proper repair job, and they decide to do that at Nevarro, where they're reunited with Cara Dune and Greef Karga. And both Cara and Greef are thrilled to see Mando, and especially the child. It's kind of the star attraction. Greef instructs his repairman to give the Razor Crest a total repair job and make it good as new. But as they're walking away from the ship, one of the repairmen is eyeing up Mando and the child. Although Mando doesn't see this, he continues to walk into town with Greef and Cara. And they're filling Mando into all the things they've been doing. Cleaning up the town, with Cara as the marshal, and Greef as kind of the impromptu mayor. And they've done a really good job of cleaning up the town. Showing him one example of that bar that they were trapped in by Moff Gideon and his men, the bar that was shot to bits, has been turned into a school. And it's at that school where Greef Karga decides to leave the child for safekeeping. The Mandalorian isn't thrilled about this, saying where he goes, I go, but Greef tells him where we're going is no place for a child. And Cara reassures him that the child will be in safekeeping at the school. There's a droid teacher and a bunch of kids around. Nothing's going to happen to him. So Mando, Greef, and Cara all head to Greef's office, where, to the Mando surprise, Mythrol, the first guy we ever saw the Mandalorian taken into custody, is sitting at the desk working for Greef Karga, and he is terrified to see the Mandalorian. Greef is taking him in a trade-off where he can work off his debt. And that debt is large, it's 350 years. They then go off and talk business. They bring up a map of Nevarro, and Nevarro is pretty much cleaned out by them. I mean, it's very safe, except for this one area with an old Imperial base. This is the same base where all the troops came from when Moff Gideon attacked them and they ended up defeating them. Now, they don't know why, but it hasn't been abandoned yet. What they do know is that there's a lot of weaponry in there. And that kind of weaponry would be big money on the black market. But Greef Karga just wants them gone. Because if they clear out that base, Nevarro could be a trade anchor for the entire sector. So with time to kill, because his ship is getting repaired, the Mandalorian, Cara, Mythrol, and Greef Karga all head off to the base. And when they get there, they're unable to get in because the wiring for the door is all messed up. Greef tasks Mythrol with trying to get in there, but he's having trouble. So the Mandalorian, using his jetpack, flies up to the top of the base, and as Mythrol is arguing with Cara, all of a sudden, a dead stormtrooper flies down and hits the ground, and the doors magically open up. The group then gets in the elevator, takes it up, and they see the Mandalorian standing there with two dead stormtroopers at his side. And the stormtroopers being there was kind of a surprise because this was supposed to be pretty empty. But Greef Karga doesn't think anything of it. He's more concerned about destroying the base. And luckily for him, he knows how to do that. The whole base is powered by a reactor, so if they sneak in and overload the reactor, the base is going to explode. So all they have to do is get into the heat shaft and drain the cooling lines, and then boom. So they head into the base, and they head to the command center where they find yet another soldier. They kill him, black out all the cameras, and grab a key. But at this point, they know they need to be careful because obviously this base is still somewhat active. So they carefully make their way down to the reactor core where it's a steep drop into very hot lava. And there's not a lot of room for error. I mean, if you slip, you're dead. So Greef Karga doesn't want that, and he doesn't want to risk Cara or Mando, so he tasks Mythrol with heading over to controls and drain the cooling lines. And Mythrol is able to do it, and it's only a matter of time before this base is up in flames. And they need to get the hell out of there. They have about 10 minutes, but as they're leaving, they see two other Imperial guards at a control center. And there was something at this control center that one of the Imperial guards did not want them to see because he's trying to destroy it, but the group ends up killing them both. But when they turn around, they see a bunch of deformed figures and tanks, and they realize that this was not a military base, but yet a lab. and they know they need to figure out what's going on. And Mithril, heading over to the control center, is able to find what they might have been trying to destroy. It's a message from Dr. Pershing, and he's explaining in this message that the test subject that they were working on rejected the blood that they had. He recommends that they suspend experimentation because he fears that the volunteer that they have is also going to die. He goes on to explain that he's exhausted all the blood that he had because the child was small, and he could only get a little bit without killing him. He finishes up the message saying that if they do continue with the experimentation, he's going to need access to the donor, and he promises not to disappoint Moff Gideon again. Initially, the Mandalorian thinks this must be an old message, but it's not. It's only 3 days old, which means Moff Gideon is not dead, as they previously thought. And because of that, the Mandalorian knows he needs to get back to the child immediately, because if Moff Gideon's out there, the child is in danger. So the Mandalorian leaves Cara, Greef, and Mithril, heading back into town to get the child and his ship. And he flies out of the base while stormtroopers are shooting him. Greef, Cara, and Mithril are also trying to get out of the base, but they get trapped. And as the stormtroopers are shooting them, Cara is able to get them out of there by hopping in a Marauder that was on the deck. And the group also heads back to town, but they have stormtroopers on their ass on speeder bikes. So Greef Karga hops in the back and mans the gun, picking off the stormtroopers one by one. And as the last stormtrooper falls, in the background, you can see the base explode. And the group thinks that they're home free, but they're not. Because right before the base exploded, 4 TIE fighters were able to take off. And they are hot on the group's tail. Greef is able to destroy one of them, but the TIE fighters are catching up quickly. And it seems like it's only a matter of time before one of these TIE fighters is able to hit the group. But luckily for the group, the Mandalorian did make it back to town, grabbing the child, grabbing his ship, and saving the group, taking on the TIE fighters by himself. Greef, Cara, and Mithril are able to make it back into town, and they hop out of the ship in just enough time to watch the Mandalorian pick off the TIE fighters one by one in the sky. And Greef radios to the Mandalorian, "How can I ever repay you?" But the Mandalorian says, "Don't worry about it, you repaired my ship, we're even." He also rejects Greef's offer to buy him a drink because he's got a Jedi to find. Now, with all this commotion that went on, the 2 X-Wing fighters that were patrolling the sky that tried to pull the Mandalorian over head to Nevarro to investigate, but Greef isn't really willing to give them any information. The X-Wing fighter even asks him how long before the Razor Crest showed up, but Greef doesn't even admit to seeing that. As the X-Wing fighter is leaving, he sees Cara, and he tries to recruit her into the Rebel Alliance, and they could really use her because he's well aware of her abilities. But she says, I'm not really into that. He says there's something going on out there. They don't believe it on the core worlds, but it's true. Something's up. These aren't isolated incidences. They need to be stopped before it's too late. But we can't do that without local support. He's not getting a response from Cara, so he tries to make a personal connection with her, telling her that he had fought in battle on her home planet. And he asks her, "Did you lose anybody?" And she says, "Yeah, I lost everybody." He then apologizes for her loss and puts down an Imperial badge, and then he leaves. But on an Imperial ship, they get a message from one of the mechanics, because the mechanic was an Imperial spy, the same one that was eyeing up the Mandalorian and the child, and he's placed a tracking chip on the Razor Crest. So he lets one of the Imperial guards know about this, and she heads to alert Moff Gideon. Moff Gideon asks if the Mandalorian still has the child, and she says yes. Our source confirmed it. To which he responds with, "We will be ready." And he isn't kidding. They are loading up with Shadow Stormtroopers. In Episode 5, the Mandalorian and the child both arrive on Corvus, and it's kind of a dark, miserable planet. Like, imagine Seattle, but like a whole planet of it. He parks his ship in the middle of the woods and starts walking around, seeing if he can pick up some kind of lead as to where this Jedi is. And he comes to a town that is heavily fortified. The guy who seems to be in charge asks what his business is, and the Mandalorian says that he's been tracking for a few days. He's looking for a layover. He's a hunter. He also tells him that he's a part of the guild, and the guy orders to open up the gate. But the Mandalorian starts walking through this town that has guards all over the place, and he goes to ask a shopkeeper some information, but the shopkeeper just leaves. He finds an elderly man that's tending to some children and tells him, "I need some information." But the man tells him, "Please don't speak to them, or to any of us." And that's when 2 guards sneak up behind him and tell him that the magistrate wants to see him. So he goes and meets with her, and she's also behind yet another wall. And she's called him to this meeting because she knows he's a Mandalorian and she has a proposition for him. She tells him that the target is priceless. It's a Jedi. The Jedi is currently stalking the magistrate, and the magistrate wants the Mandalorian to kill her. And if he does that, she's going to hand over this spear made of pure Beskar. Now, he doesn't tell her that he's actually looking for the same Jedi, but just asks, "Okay, where do I find her?" And they give him where they think that she'll be located. So the Mandalorian and the child go off to that location, and it doesn't take long for the Jedi to pop up. And since she hasn't had a real good run-in with people on this planet, she immediately goes into fight mode. Luckily for the Mandalorian, her 2 lightsabers can't penetrate the Beskar, and he's able to get enough space between him and the Jedi to yell, "Ahsoka Tano, Bo-Katan sent me. We need to talk." He takes her and shows her the child, and that night lets her interact with the child a little bit. And he asks her, is he speaking to you? Do you understand him? And she says, in a way, Grogu and I can feel each other's thoughts. And Grogu is actually the child's name. She tells him how he was raised at the Jedi Temple in Coruscant. Many masters trained him over the years. But at the end of the Clone Wars, when the Empire rose to power, somebody took him from the temple. After that, his memory becomes dark. She tells the Mandalorian that she's known only one other being like this, a wise old Jedi master named Yoda. She asks the Mandalorian, can he still use the Force? And he tells her, I've seen him do things that I can't explain. He then tells her that he's here because he was supposed to bring him to a Jedi. But unfortunately, she tells him that the Jedi Order fell a long time ago. But he points out, yeah, so did the Empire, and they still hunt him. He needs your help. So that morning, she tests him using a rock, harnessing the Force and floating the rock over to Grogu. But when she wants the rock back, Grogu gets frustrated and just drops it. So she has the Mandalorian try, seeing if maybe Grogu will listen to the Mandalorian. But when Grogu doesn't lift the stone, Ahsoka Tano says we'll try to connect with him. So the Mandalorian pulls out a knob from the ship that Grogu's always trying to get at, and that works. I mean, Grogu uses the power to snatch that thing. And the Mandalorian's pumped because he did it. But Ahsoka Tano, seeing this, says, I can't train him. His attachment to you makes him vulnerable. I've seen what such feelings can do to a fully trained Jedi Knight. And I'm not going to start this child down that path. It's best to just let his powers fade away. She then tries to walk away, but the Mandalorian says, the magistrate sent me to kill you. Now, I didn't agree to anything, and I'll help you with your problem as long as you see to it that Grogu is properly trained. Right before they devise a plan, though, Ahsoka Tano fills him in on who the magistrate actually is, because she doesn't want a Mandalorian heading in there and underestimating her. Her name is Morgan Elsbeth. During the Clone Wars, her people were massacred. Now, she survived, but she used that anger to fuel the industry that built an Imperial Starfleet. And with them, she destroyed worlds. And from the looks of the planet they're on, it looks like this is her latest casualty. She asked the Mandalorian, when you were in the city, did you see any prisoners? And he says, yeah, I saw 3 chained up. And she says, well, we got to find a way to free them. So they devise a plan where Ahsoka Tano heads to the front of the gate and takes out all of the guards. And she does that with little resistance. She ends up going to the town square where the magistrate has met her along with her army behind her, but the magistrate tells the army to not fire. And Ahsoka Tano throws a piece of the Beskar armor from the Mandalorian on the ground and says, your assassin failed. Where is your master? But the magistrate doesn't answer, instructing her men to kill her. And Ahsoka Tano hops up on the rooftops and starts trying to escape, but in the process, dividing the army. Right as the last men are about to leave, she instructs 2 of the guards to execute the prisoners that are chained up. But right before the guards are able to do that, the Mandalorian pops out and kills the 2 soldiers. And along with the help of the old man who told them, please don't talk to any of us, they free the prisoners. Ahsoka Tano, meanwhile, is taking out most of this army by herself. And she's standing on the top of the wall when Lang, the magistrate's number 2, shows up in the town square staring at the Mandalorian. And now he realizes that the Mandalorian and the Jedi are working together. But he's only going to have to square off with the Mandalorian because Ahsoka Tano goes over the wall to confront the magistrate. And they start battling out, with the magistrate wielding a pure Beskar spear and Ahsoka Tano wielding her 2 lightsabers. And Lang and the Mandalorian can hear this going on, and Lang says, I wonder who's going to win, your side or mine. But Ahsoka Tano is able to get the spear away from the magistrate, putting a lightsaber to her throat and demanding to know, where is her master? Where is Grand Admiral Thrawn? Now, we don't know if she gave up the information, but what we do know is the town was liberated by the Mandalorian and Ahsoka Tano, with that old man being put back in charge. Ahsoka Tano gives the Mandalorian the spear, even though he doesn't think he deserves it because he didn't complete the job, but she tells him, this spear belongs to a Mandalorian. So take it. Now, he was doing all of this without Grogu. Grogu was back in the ship. So he goes to get Grogu to give him to Ahsoka Tano, as per their arrangement. But Ahsoka Tano says, I'm not going to train him. She realized that the Mandalorian is like a father figure to Grogu, and splitting them up might do more harm than good. She says there is a possibility, though. Go to Tython. You'll find the ruins of an ancient temple that has a strong connection to the Force. Put Grogu on the Seeing Stone at the top of the mountain. And after that, Grogu chooses his path. If he reaches out through the Force, there's a chance that a Jedi might sense his presence and come after him, although there aren't many Jedi left. So with that tip, the Mandalorian and Grogu head off, leaving Ahsoka Tano on the planet. In Episode 6, the Mandalorian and the child head to that planet that was told to them by Ahsoka Tano. And the Mandalorian parks his ship, he heads up to the rock, and he places the child on it, but nothing happens. And as the Mandalorian is trying to get something to happen, he notices that his ship has arrived. So at that point, he needs to get the hell out of there. He doesn't know who these people are, but when he turns around, that is suddenly when the child has decided to harness the power of the Jedi. And when the Mandalorian tries to get to the child, the force field that the child has created actually pushes the Mandalorian back. He can't penetrate this thing. So the Mandalorian decides to investigate who is actually in this ship, and it turns out to be Boba Fett. He's been tracking the Mandalorian, and he wants his armor back, but the Mandalorian is hesitant to give it up, and Boba Fett isn't telling him that he's a Mandalorian. Boba Fett tells him that the armor is his and it was given to him by his father. And then he reveals that he has a sharpshooter on a ridge ready to fire. But not at the Mandalorian, the sharpshooter is ready to fire on the child. And when he looks up on the ridge, to his surprise, the sharpshooter is Fennec, who he thought was dead. I mean, he left her for dead, but it turns out that Boba Fett actually saved her, and because of that, she is forever in his debt. Now, Boba Fett isn't trying to muscle the Mandalorian into giving him his armor. He's willing to make a negotiation saying, if you give me the armor, I guarantee the safety of both you and the child. And that's a pretty good offer because there's a massive bounty on the child's head. A bounty that's worth way more than the armor. But that conversation is interrupted when yet another ship shows up. So the Mandalorian heads up to check on the child while Boba Fett and Fennec go to investigate who these people are, and it turns out that the ship is full of stormtroopers. And while the Mandalorian is unsuccessfully trying to get to the child because he still can't penetrate the force field, Boba Fett and Fennec piece up this ship of stormtroopers, just demolishing them. But as soon as they finish up, yet another ship of stormtroopers arrives, coming at them in waves. But it's becoming more and more difficult to fight them off. Fennec and Boba Fett actually get broken up, and Fennec is kind of surrounded by stormtroopers. But luckily for her, the Mandalorian, realizing that there was nothing he could really do with the child, goes down to help them fight. Of course, as soon as he leaves, the child ends up dropping the force field, so he's just sitting there like a lame duck. But the Mandalorian ends up saving Fennec, helping her fight off the stormtroopers, as does Boba Fett, who is now wearing his armor, because he ended up coming across the Mandalorian ship that was open, and he decided to go in and grab his armor. So the Mandalorian, Boba Fett, Fennec, they end up killing a lot of the stormtroopers, and the ones that survived end up getting in the ship to flee. But the ship doesn't get too far because Boba Fett fires a rocket from his jetpack and destroys the ship. Although that's not the only ship that's destroyed, because shortly after that happens, something shoots out of the sky and absolutely destroys the Mandalorian ship, blowing it to bits. And at this point, they know that they're not alone. So Boba Fett makes his way to his ship, while the Mandalorian and Fennec try to make their way up the mountain to grab the child and make sure he's okay. But the child is in danger, because Moff Gideon is hovering in the sky in his own ship, and having just destroyed the Mandalorian ship, he ends up sending a bunch of dark troopers down to pick up the child. And unfortunately for the Mandalorian and Fennec, they arrive just a few seconds too late, but in enough time to see that the child has been taken by the dark troopers as the dark troopers head back up to Moff Gideon. At this point, though, Boba Fett has arrived at his ship, and he's following these dark troopers to see where they're going. But when the clouds clear, to his shock, he radios to Fennec saying, "Oh my god, the Empire's back." Now, Boba Fett's ship is pretty small. He can't fight off this Imperial cruiser, and it doesn't even matter because the Imperial cruiser floors it and gets out of there. And when Boba Fett gets back down to the ground, he sees that the Mandalorian is investigating the destruction of his own ship. And the only things that survived are the Beskar spear that he got and this little knob that the child used to play with. The Mandalorian, realizing there's nothing left, slowly makes his way over to Fennec and Boba Fett. And Boba Fett, who is still wearing his armor, is able to prove to the Mandalorian that it is indeed his armor. And when he does that, the Mandalorian tells him, "Okay, well then our deal's complete." But Boba Fett says, "No, it isn't. I told you that if you give me this armor, you'll be safe and the child is safe. And the child isn't safe right now. Until we return the child back to you, our deal is not complete. So me and Fennec are in your service." So Fennec, Boba Fett, and the Mandalorian head to Nevarro, where there's a new sheriff in town, and her name is Cara Dune. I should say Marshal, but, you know, there's a new Marshal in town isn't really a saying. The Mandalorian has shown up, though, looking for a favor. He needs to know where Mayfield is, because he's looking to break him out. He figures Mayfield can help him locate Moff Gideon's cruiser. Cara Dune is very reluctant to do this, because she has respect for the badge. But her attitude changes when the Mandalorian reveals that it's only because Moff Gideon now has the child. And while this is going down, the child is in custody of Moff Gideon, completely zapped of his powers. He's just exhausted. But the reason he's exhausted is because he just took out 2 stormtroopers. And Moff gets down next to him and says, "You've gotten really good at that, but it makes you oh so sleepy." He then shows him his darksaber, and the child does reach for it, but he says, No, you're not ready to play with that." Moff then turns to one of the stormtroopers and instructs him to put the kid to sleep. And he does that, and he puts the child in shackles. He then instructs what appears like his second in command that once they get out of hyperspace, alert Dr. Pershing through an encrypted message that they have the donor. In Episode 7, Cara Dune has located where Mayfield is being held prisoner, and she's able to get him released. She goes to get him into her own custody, and he can't figure out who she is or why he's being released to her. And he keeps questioning, and he gets really worried when he sees the Mandalorian show up. They explain to him that the only reason that they're, quote, breaking him out is because he's ex-Imperial. because they need to find out where Moff Gideon's cruiser is. He tells him, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. That's ridiculous. But then Cara reveals the reason why they're doing it is because Moff Gideon has the child. And everybody gets attached to him, so it changes everybody's perspective. But he does say, well, what's in it for me exactly? Do I get to go free? But Cara Dune says, no, that's not how this works. What's in it for you is you get a better view for a little bit. He tells them that he can't get access to where the cruiser is unless he gets to an Imperial terminal. And there's one on Morak. So that's where the group heads, although they don't really believe him, but sure enough, there's a refinery in there. And they're refining Rhydonian, which is highly volatile, highly explosive material. And unfortunately for them, there's a lot of Imperial guards there. So their plan is to do this quick and quiet. Get in, get the coordinates, and get out. And the plan is to have Mayfield go with the Mandalorian, posing as Imperial guards, into the facility. And this initially wasn't the plan, but it has to be because he's the only one whose genetic DNA will not pop up on the registry. Everybody else, they're going to be flagged. So the group waits for a vehicle to pass by, jump out, hijack it, and steal the armor so they look the part. Mayfield and the Mandalorian then make their way to the refinery with Fennec on a ridge making sure that they're okay. And the vehicle ends up passing through the local village, which it doesn't look like they're a big fan of the Empire. The villagers are kind of mean-mugging Mayfield and the Mandalorian because they're in Imperial armor. And it's shortly after leaving this small village, their route gets rerouted because there's a huge explosion up ahead. Pirates are attacking the Empire, and that includes the vehicle that Mandalorian and Mayfield are driving. These pirates are trying to set explosives on the Rhydonium so it blows everything up. And it forces the Mandalorian to go on the vehicle as it's moving and fight them off. And it gets pretty close there for a while, but luckily for the Mandalorian and Mayfield, they're saved when they get really close to the refinery and a TIE fighter comes out and shoots out the pirates. They're then welcomed into the refinery with excitement from a bunch of stormtroopers because they're the only cargo shipments to make it. Mayfield whispers to the Mandalorian, okay, now it's time to actually locate the terminal. Because they're not really planning on staying that long. And it doesn't take long for Mayfield to locate one, but when he goes in to use it, he notices a guy named Valen Hess, who he used to serve under when he worked for the Empire, and he's really worried that this guy is going to recognize him. He's not quite sure if he will recognize him because he was only a field operative, but he doesn't want to take the chance. He tells the Mandalorian, I'm sorry, we have to abort, but the Mandalorian says, I can't, because if we don't get these coordinates, I lose the child forever. He tells Mayfield, just give me the stick, I'll do it, but Mayfield says, no, you can't, because in order to access the terminal, it has to scan your face, and Mayfield knows that the Mandalorian isn't going to take his helmet off. But this is a situation where desperate times call for desperate measures. He grabs the stick, heads in to use the terminal, and tries to use it without taking off his helmet, but he triggers an error message that has a countdown set to shutting down the system, and it forces the Mandalorian to actually take his helmet off and scan his face. The Mandalorian is able to get the coordinates, but he's piqued the interest of Valen Hess, who walks over to him and starts questioning him on what he's doing there and asking him for something called a TK number, and the Mandalorian has no idea what a TK number is. He's trying to think of what he can tell this guy to get out of this when Mayfield pops up and gives Valen Hess a fake TK number, risking the chance that Valen Hess might actually recognize him, but luckily for everybody, Valen Hess doesn't. Mayfield tells him that the Mandalorian can't really hear all that well, so he's going to have to speak up. Mayfield quickly answers this guy's questions and tries to get the hell out of there, but Hess wants to reward them because they were the only shipment to deliver their cargo. So he heads over to a table and starts pouring drinks for them. And when they're trying to figure out something to toast to, Mayfield says, let's do a toast to Operation Cinder. Hess gets excited, saying, oh, there's a man who knows his history, but Mayfield says, I don't just know it, I lived it. And apparently Operation Cinder did not go well for a lot of people, and it's because of Valen Hess. He sacrificed a lot of lives and a lot of people that Mayfield knew. And you can tell that Mayfield has always held it against this guy because those people didn't need to die. It certainly doesn't help when Hess mentions that they're going to use the Rhydonium to wreak havoc on innocent civilians, so the civilians that do survive have to come back to the Empire. And at that point, Mayfield's heard enough and actually shoots him. He kills Hess, but he does end up alerting pretty much the entire refinery that they don't belong. And they have to fight their way to the roof where Boba Fett is going to pick them up. Luckily for them, they have Cara Dune and Fennec on a ridge helping them out. And once they hop in Boba Fett's ship and they're flying away, Mayfield uses his sharpshooting ability to actually hit a bunch of the Rhydonium and blow the entire refinery up. A shot that impresses both Fennec and Cara Dune. And after he makes the shot, he turns to the Mandalorian and says, we all have to sleep at night. But unfortunately for them, they're not out of the woods quite yet because 2 TIE fighters did escape just in the nick of time of the refinery, and they are on Boba Fett's ass. Although as the 2 TIE fighters are chasing them, Boba Fett releases something that creates like a sonic boom force field that destroys them. I don't know. Somebody in the comments section will clarify it. But it was awesome. and Boba Fett is able to get Mayfield and the Mandalorian safely back to the ground. The Mandalorian thanks Mayfield for helping out. Mayfield says, yeah, good luck getting the kid back. He then turns to Cara Dune and says, all right, officer, take me back. But Cara Dune acts like she's having a private conversation with the Mandalorian saying, it's a real shame about Mayfield that he died in that refinery accident. I mean, I would have loved to bring him back, but he was the only casualty. Implying that they're not going to take him back. They're going to release him. He's fine and free to go. And he's shocked, but he's not going to complain. The group heads off, and now that they know where Moff Gideon's cruiser is, they're able to send him a message. And they do that. The Mandalorian tells Moff Gideon, now you have something that I want. You may think you have some idea of what you're in possession of, but you don't. And soon, he will be back with me. He means more to me than you will ever know. In the season finale, using the information that they've stolen, they've located an Imperial ship that happens to have Dr. Pershing on it. They neutralize the ship and board it, but one of the pilots takes Dr. Pershing hostage, trying to have some leverage against the Mandalorian, Boba Fett, Fennec, and Cara. He makes an unwise decision, though, when he starts mocking Cara about how he destroyed her planet, and that ends up getting him shot in the face. So they now have Dr. Pershing along with an Imperial ship. But the Mandalorian knows that he needs more than that. What he needs is Bo-Katan. They end up locating both Bo-Katan and Koska Reeves, and the Mandalorian says, I need your help. But all Bo-Katan and Reeves can focus on is the fact that Boba Fett is not a Mandalorian. They start squabbling about that, but they do push it aside when the Mandalorian tells them what he needs them for. He explains that Moff Gideon has the child, and Bo-Katan says, well, I'm sorry, but he's gone. But the Mandalorian says, no, I've located him. And that changes everything. She agrees to help the Mandalorian, but in exchange, they're going to keep Moff Gideon's cruiser in order to help retake Mandalore. She also wants the darksaber, telling the Mandalorian that Moff Gideon has it, she wants it. Because with the darksaber, she is so close to retaking Mandalore. She explains that the darksaber is a very powerful weapon, and in fact, the only thing it can't cut through is pure Beskar. Although, truth be told, the Mandalorian says, I don't really care about any of that, I just care about getting the child. So, if you want that, it's yours. They start going through the specifications of Moff Gideon's cruiser as Dr. Pershing is watching it, and Dr. Pershing actually fills them in on certain schematics about the cruiser. Namely, the fact that it used to have a bunch of people in it, but now it only has a few, and that's because it is full of dark troopers. Powerful droids that are extremely tough to take down. He also tells them where the child will be located and where Moff Gideon will be located. So the plan is to use Dr. Pershing's ship and act like it is being attacked by Boba Fett's. This will open the bay doors, and they're not going to ask too many questions because an Imperial ship is being attacked. So the Mandalorian, Cara, Reeves, Bo-Katan, Fennec, they're going to Trojan horse this thing. Now, initially, when they land in the cruiser, all of the women are going to take off, killing all of the stormtroopers on board, making a lot of noise on their way to the bay where Moff Gideon should be located. The Mandalorian is going to hide back a little bit, and while the women are distracting pretty much the entire ship, the Mandalorian is going to make his way to the child. They need to figure out, though, what to do about the Dark Troopers, and that is going to rest on the Mandalorian. It's his job to lock them in the bay door before they're deployed. So the plan goes into action, with Boba Fett pretending to attack this Imperial ship, and the ship making its way to the launch tube. And the Imperial cruiser lets them know, stay clear of the launch tube because they're launching out TIE fighters that can help fight off Boba Fett. But that's not part of the plan, and Bo-Katan isn't listening. She's going head on for the launch tube, not listening to instructions to stay clear of it. And she ends up kind of crashing the ship a little bit. Once she's in, though, Boba Fett takes off. And the soldiers who are in the cruiser immediately start yelling at the pilot to get that thing out of here because, it kind of crashed. But then the women pop out and start killing everybody. And that's when Moff Gideon knows he has a problem. He instructs his second-in-command to release all of the Dark Troopers. And as their women are making their way to Moff Gideon, the Mandalorian sneaks out quietly, making his way to the area where the Dark Troopers are. Unfortunately for the Mandalorian, he sees that they've been deployed, and he frantically goes to trap them in there, but one of them ends up getting out, and this thing is no joke. I mean, it's really doing a number on the Mandalorian like we've never seen before. And the Mandalorian is trying everything, including whistling birds, but nothing is working. He is, however, finally able to destroy it when he takes his Beskar spear and shoves it right in its neck, ripping off its head. He then makes his way over to the terminal and releases all of the Dark Troopers into space. Now, at this point, the women have made their way to the front of the ship where Moff Gideon is supposed to be located, but he's not. And that's because Moff Gideon is standing above the child with a darksaber. And when the Mandalorian shows up, he's pretty surprised and also pretty concerned for the child. Moff Gideon makes him drop his blaster, and the Mandalorian tells him, I just want the kid. But he says, no, the kid's fine. Moff Gideon tells him how he knows that he's with Bo-Katan. and admits that the darksaber used to belong to Bo-Katan. He figures that they've arrived at the bridge and they're probably seeking him, or more accurately, the darksaber, because Bo-Katan wants the darksaber because it brings power. He tells the Mandalorian that whoever wields the darksaber has every right to lay claim to the Mandalorian throne. But the Mandalorian doesn't want it, telling him to keep it. He just wants to get the child and get out of there. So it seems like the two have struck a deal. Moff Gideon is going to keep the darksaber, and the Mandalorian's going to grab the child and go. And the two hope to never run into each other. And this works for Moff Gideon because he says, I've already got what I want from the child. I wanted his blood. The kid has been blessed with potential and rare possibilities to bring order back to the galaxy. So, yeah, sure, take him. But when the Mandalorian goes to get him, Moff Gideon reneges on their offer and tries to attack him with a darksaber. But the Mandalorian is covered in Beskar, so it's not really working. And the two put up a fight, but eventually the Mandalorian, along with his Beskar spear, are able to get Moff Gideon to drop the darksaber. And the Mandalorian handcuffs Moff Gideon and has him at the mercy of the darksaber. He brings him to the bridge where you can tell that Bo-Katan is not happy. And that's because the darksaber is now the Mandalorian's. Moff Gideon explains that the only way to wield the darksaber is to win it in battle. And you can't give it away because the Mandalorian tries to do that with Bo-Katan, and that's not the way this works. She legitimately has to beat him in a battle. He can't just simply yield. And it is quite upsetting to Bo-Katan. She thought she was getting this thing back. She thought that she could lay claim to the Mandalorian throne, and now the Mandalorian has it. And there's really nothing she can do about it other than to beat him up. But the group is interrupted when they're about to be boarded, not by people, but by dark troopers. The same dark troopers who were sucked out of the cargo bay, well, they've come back. And Moff Gideon is beside himself with glee because he knows that the Mandalorian struggled with just one of them. What are they going to do against a fleet of them? So he puts the child down and tells him, don't worry, kid, I'll get you out of this. And the group closes the doors and gets ready for whatever's on the other side of these things. The Dark Troopers, meanwhile, have started to try to punch their way through it. But as they're doing that, an X-Wing shows up. And they try to get in touch with who's ever in the cockpit, but he doesn't answer. And Cara even makes the joke of, yay, we're saved, one X-Wing. But when that X-Wing shows up, it definitely piques Grogu's interest. And the Dark Troopers stop punching. And that's because that X-Wing had a Jedi on it. And Moff Gideon's smile turns to straight fear. At one point, he ends up jumping up and shooting Reeves and trying to shoot the child, but the Mandalorian dives in front of the bullets. He then tries to commit suicide so he doesn't give up any secrets, but Cara Dune is able to knock the gun away and knock him out. And now the group is simply watching this Jedi go through these Dark Troopers like a hot knife through butter. And when he gets to the door, the Mandalorian opens it up because the Mandalorian knows the Jedi is there for the child. And when the Jedi walks through, calm and cool and collected, he puts down his hood and it's a young Luke Skywalker in the flesh. He gestures to the child for him to come with him, but the Mandalorian says he doesn't want to go with you. And Luke says, well, that's because he's waiting for your permission. Luke explains the child has a bunch of talent and ability, but he needs training. He swears to the Mandalorian that he will give his life to protect the child, but the child will truly not be saved until he masters all of his powers. So after this convincing speech, the Mandalorian goes and picks up the child and explains that the child is going to go with Luke Skywalker, because he's one of his kind. He also promises the child that he will see him again. And the child is kind of soaking this all in, and the Mandalorian realizes that this truly might be the last time he does see the child. So he does something he's only done once before. He takes off his helmet so the child can see his face. He then says goodbye to the child, and the child waddles his way over to Luke Skywalker to be picked up. And then Luke, the child, and even R2-D2 end up taking off as the Mandalorian, who still has his helmet off, is left pretty emotional, saying goodbye to his friend. But that is not the end of Season 2. Because after this went down, Fennec and Boba Fett went to go pay an old friend a visit on Tatooine, Bib Fortuna. Bib was on the throne of Jabba the Hutt's palace, running things just like Jabba the Hutt. But both Boba Fett, Fennec kill him, and Boba Fett claims Jabba's throne. And that is the end of Season 2 of The Mandalorian. Thank you so much for getting this part of the recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Like the video if you liked it. Hit thumbs down if you don't. But please just don't be a jerk in the comments section. And if you do write something in the comments section and I don't get back to you, it's just because I usually try to stay away from comments. Because usually the comment section is a cesspool. But feel free to write your theories and what you thought of this season down below.